I'd like to introduce the President and CEO of Laramide Resources, Mark Henderson.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk to you about our company and about uranium and the supply side a little bit, because we heard a lot about the demand side on the macro, and I think the supply side is complicated, and it's not as easy maybe as people make it out to be, and I don't think it's as modelable as the big organizations that make a lot of the predictions, and that would include W&A, make it out to be. There's not a lot of probability weighting into these projects and where they come from and the scale of the projects, et cetera, et cetera. I have to give Corey a thanks for the plug. I don't think it was intended. He's not my setup man. We were the cheapest of the U.S. guys on the list, or the developer list, I think, in terms of per pound. That's partly because we have our goal has been to become a supplier of choice to the utilities, particularly the Western utilities, and we have a couple of big chunky projects that have a lot of pounds in them. And I think the other thing we managed to do through what's been an incredibly long bear market is we kind of kept control of the cap structure in the company. So I think as you go through this, you'll realize that there's a reason why it's so cheap, but it's not cheap for bad reasons. I think it's cheap just because it's been out of favor. It's been an awful long bear market that we've been through. So we go through the standard. We'll spend very little time on that. The macro, obviously, we have a couple of big chunky assets, which we'll talk about. As I said, we wanted to be a diversified supplier. I think that's important. I think the things that utilities are looking for, if they had a wish list, they want large-scale projects on the right part of the cost curve in the right jurisdictions that can deliver into their contract book for probably a decade or longer. That's kind of the first prize for the utilities. And that's when we're talking about the utility contracting the market the way it was. And I think that was an interesting topic earlier on. I think the contract market has evolved a little bit. Whether it evolves back or not remains to be seen. But I think it's not the same market. If you have a project that you're trying to bring to market, this is not the same market that it was 10 or 15 years ago for basically the same project. And we'll get to one that we have in Australia that really will make that case. So as I said, we've got couple of big chunky projects, which I'll talk about. One, Church Rock, which is a big ISR project in New Mexico. I think everyone now is familiar with the ISR methodology. It's where all the production in Kazakhstan comes from. We have grades that are actually comparable to what they have there in Kazakhstan. Obviously not the scale of the resource. And then we have what's a conventional open pit type mine in Queensland, Australia. Out in the open where everything is in Australia, but much larger scale. It's an ex-Rio Tinto project. That was basically put together by us starting 15 years ago, and we've had a lot of work done on it. It's probably cumulatively had $60 or $70 million spent on it by us since we've owned it. In addition, we own a couple of other projects that I'll only touch on. They're also in New Mexico. One's a hard rock project called the Jara Mesa that frankly probably needs to be part of it's a very interesting 232 asset, I think, because it probably needs to be part of a bigger hard rock revival in New Mexico that would require a timeline long enough for you to actually take on things like thinking about building mills and stuff like that. So it's an ideal asset for contracting. It's an asset that's probably would be better as part of a bigger group of hard rock assets. And in particular, with the Roca Honda stuff that's owned by EFR is a natural matchup for this, where you could put together a 50 million pound hard rock thing that could justify a 3 million pound a day or pound a year mill. And the history of just for people on this 232 that don't understand the history of production in New Mexico or in the United States, the early wave of production in the United States was all New Mexico. They produced between 13 and 19 million pounds a year between the late 50s all the way up to 1980 when basically the first U.S. boom ended. They left behind, and when they closed down, there were 7 operating mills in New Mexico, hard rock mills, and they eventually all got torn down. And they were owned by people like Homestake, Kerr-McGee, oil companies basically were in the nuclear business by the time the 70s came to an end. So they probably left behind 2 or 3 million, 200 million good hard rock pounds in New Mexico that are owned by various players. So the idea that you could have 232 and produce 10 or 12 million pounds a year given time, it's not a fanciful idea. It's actually quite doable. Finally, we have a smaller asset that's production ready. It's permitted. It needs to go into EFR's mill. It's about 60 miles away from EFR's mill. We had a contract with them back in 2013 to do exactly that. And they basically shut the mill down, and they're probably not going to open that mill. It's a hard rock mill. They're probably not going to open that mill until we see $50 would be my guess, maybe more. But it could be up and running right away and could do maybe 500,000 pounds a year. It's an ex-Homestake asset. In terms of what we're trying to do this year, we've been very quiet. Obviously, it's been a long market. We've been trying to we're in what I call the survivor group on the production side. We lived through the huge cycle, the boom that we had. By the time it came to an end in sort of 07, 08, you went from 10 companies to probably 700. Some of us were there at the time, including Dev. We were there even earlier than that. But basically, all the assets that are left and are in the 25 or 30 public companies today, they're all assets that I believe are important and they'll be part of the future supply. And we will probably need all of those assets and more, because every time China turns on a power plant, it's a 60-year asset that they're building, and I can't imagine that we have globally more than about 15 or 20 years of known uranium supply, and that includes all of the new discoveries on the west side of the basin. So I think we're going to be in a much better market than I think people realize. And I think realistically, for any supply to happen, I think we need $40 at least for any of the production in the world, that's particularly U.S. stuff, even ISR, low-cost ISR stuff, to come back. So we're basically waiting for the price signal, because I think the market is telling you the way it trades, the way all these juniors trade, we basically need price. And they all really kind of tend to rally as a group. It's an unusual market. It doesn't happen in gold or copper, where the biggest market cap company kind of trades in an unbelievably highly correlated range with companies like ours. But I think if you looked at the charts of all these development and even exploration uranium companies, they all trade like that. Because basically the market's saying it's really a momentum-driven, price-driven thing, and that's what it was the last time. It was really, really a big, phenomenal momentum-driven market by the time it got ahead of steam up. There's a little bit on our corporate structure. You can see the stock's doing really not whole lot in the last year, basically going sideways. I think all these charts kind of look the same. As I said, we've tried to keep a handle on the cap structure. There's about 135 million shares out. Insiders own about 10 to 12% of it. We've got the usual other smaller institutional type names that are in our company. I think there's some interesting things that are starting to happen in terms of new pools of capital that are coming into the space. I think that's probably only going to get bigger as we go forward. I think really most of the folks that are in this market now, I would say, are the people that are really the true believers in the whole nuclear thesis and have done all the work and have actually committed capital. Some of them have probably been there, probably like us, probably wondering why it's taking so long. But I do think most of certainly the mainstream folks and even the commodity folks, they're really not in this trade yet. There was, and I thought it was a great development, there's a new ETF that got put in place, which is really the pure play ETF, which is done by Horizons. I think that was basically an attempt to correct the issue that happened with the URA, which ended up, because of liquidity concerns and other things, having to basically scale down and put a lot of big cap ballast in the company. Because of liquidity problems and because of what they saw that happened with the GDXJ. They were a 10% holder of ours in there, so a lot of these companies have also gone through the ringer where they were being held in a big way by that URA. All that stock got redistributed. Now there's a new source that's probably a much more stable source of funding going forward, which is this new Horizons ETF. I think the symbol is HURA. It's very early days in that. It's a very good way to play a diversified thematic on the whole group. A little bit of background on the people. I'll just talk on a couple of them. One of them, our most newest addition as a director, is a guy named Rafi Babikian. He was a corporate development guy at Areva going back a decade or more. He was also a board member of Fission not too long ago, and he was also involved for quite a while in Berkeley and also in John Borshoff's Paladin back when it was producing. And I'll just speak a little bit about my COO in Australia, Bryn Jones. He's a chemical engineer, early 40s. Ran the Beverly mine there, the original Beverly mine, not Beverly 4 Mile. So that's an ISR mine. We have the expertise basically to scale up. We've been very careful about adding personnel and everything else. The industry has a pool of talent that can be mobilized in a reasonably short time frame. However, I would say that one of the issues for the industry is that the talent pool, by and large, is getting older. So we do need to have this recovery start to happen sometime soon. Catalyst, I won't talk about these macro things too much because we've dwelled on that a lot. You guys know all this stuff already. 232 is interesting. Wild speculation on the 232 about why it's taking so long. I noticed when the Chinese started talking about rare earths and stuff that it may be not at the ideal time frame to start talking about commodity tit for tat things, and I'm wondering if we're going to wait to see the back of the China trade deal or what happens at the end of June before we finally see what happens with 232. It would be an untimely moment, really, to kind of introduce another element into those discussions. So maybe perhaps that's why it's taking so long. We are optimistic. We obviously know the folks that brought the action. It is very doable. There's a bunch of different ways they could solve it. The softest way of all is just sort of getting the U.S. utilities to embrace the production side of the industry a little more than they have historically. Would be quite nice directionally. Obviously, they can go a lot further than that. The U.S. utilities historically have been supporters of U.S. domestic producers. They've typically done that by giving out very, very good contracts. They don't put any money up, but they'll give you very fair contracts with lots of flexibility in the contracts. And if you saw what happened with a company called Peninsula that got a fabulous contract right before Fukushima, they were basically able to build their whole mine off the back of one $70 contract. So the U.S. utilities, I think, are just waiting to see what happens, and I think we'll then have some clarity that we can deal with. I mean, we've dealt with this market before, obviously. A couple of takeaways from what we all know happened in the past. We had an amazing run up. We had 10 companies, 700 companies. We went from $7 to $135. We didn't find a lot of uranium. So most of the uranium in the world that's out there today, including all the stuff in Kazakhstan that was found by the Russians, basically was found in the 70s and the 80s. And so the idea that there's a lot of supply around is really not true. The other thing is about how long this market takes. So if you notice on when the market cracked after 08, the GFC in 08, that was really a scenario. And if you look at the term market took a long time to come down. This is a very slow moving market. So when this market starts getting better, it'll get better and it'll stay better for a long time. But that chart shows the two issues that really dog nuclear. One in 08 was what happened with the GFC was no one thought anybody could afford a nuclear power plant ever again. And I do think in terms of future nuclear growth, that is an important thing because building a $5 billion ticket item really is a limited pool of players that could do that. And so I do think one of nuclear's challenges is to figure out ways to make that easier for other nations if this whole market's going to broaden out. And then obviously we had the secondary public opinion scenario that happened around Fukushima. And those are really the two biggest issues that are around nuclear. But we've sort of paid the price here. And I think it's, I think we're setting up for what should be a long run once it turns. I think on this demand supply shock thing, we all know about the demand shock. Japan turned all the plants off overnight. It's 10% of the market. What people don't realize is that Kazakhstan basically went from 10 million pounds a year to 50, 60 million pounds a year at the same time. And so you had a demand shock and a supply shock, one on top of one another. And that's part of the reason that we've taken so long to get out of this. And I do think we're well along in the process of all those inventories coming to rest and basically getting in a market where the utilities are going to need more supply. And part of the reason Kazakhstan did that is obviously they knew that the Chinese bill was coming. It mirrored the American bill. The Chinese did everything they said they were going to do. They're virtually at the number they said they were going to hit in 2020 back in 2005. And now they're going to the second wave. So I think the demand side of the market, it's healthy enough, certainly, in terms of what's going to happen. Certainly for the companies, the guys that have the projects that are available today, and I would say there's 25 or 30 companies that own all of those projects. All of those projects in some format or another are probably going to happen and come into the market. I'll skip that slide. Yeah, so if we talk about where all these projects are, I think this is another thing that's interesting to note in terms of how the market will evolve on the supply side. I think all of these projects aren't created equally. We have a lot of potential supply in different companies and everything else, but there's projects that are very, very large, very high capex, and then there's projects like ours at Church Rock where they're 1 million pounds a year and they come on for very low capex. So it's going to be some interesting mix of how these projects evolve and get brought into the marketplace, because the very nature of the projects themselves geologically doesn't lend themselves to kind of an analysis that it can just come along in the ordinary course, because of the challenges that you'll have to actually physically bring some of these projects on board. In terms of where we are in our projects, our U.S. project is a high-grade ISR project in northern New Mexico. It's got 50 plus million pounds. It's got very good grade. We think the cash cost will be on the order of $20 or less. It's amenable to being sequenced, so bringing it on 1 million pounds at a time up to the capacity that we're allowed to build, which is 3 million pounds. It has an NRC license. We acquired this project from a company called URI, which is now Westwater. and we were the royalty holder. When the royalty was held by General Electric, which sort of gives you a sense of the provenance of a lot of these uranium projects. And if you go through a lot of these companies, you'll find that the original explorer developer was, an oil company, Mobil Oil or what have you. So it's a very common thing. That project was found basically too late in the last cycle, the American cycle, to ever get developed, and it's been sitting around for 30, 35 years waiting to come out of the ground. So it's a very good project. A lot of work's been done. A lot of the permitting work's been done. We have one state permit to get. It takes about a year. We're targeting production shovel ready in maybe about 18 months to 2 years. And it's $30 million for the first £1 million. So it's very doable. It's very doable without the contracts. In terms of where that project sits versus the other ones in terms of scale and size and grade and what have you, gives you a sense of where we are versus some of the peer group projects. Part of the reason this project, and maybe part of the reason our valuation is low, is we didn't have the visibility on this project because of the way it was held. First of all, we had the crazy royalty over the top of it. Secondarily, the company that had it was a U.S. company that doesn't do 43101s, doesn't have to talk about anything basically. Held it for years, was a NASDAQ company. The actual asset we own now is a product of a bunch of real estate transactions that were done right before we bought it that made the project twice as big and put all the land sections together under one roof for the first time. So when we did the resource, I think people were probably a little bit surprised at how big the project was. The second half of this year, we're going to do the economic study on it. I think give people a sense of what the numbers look like, how it scales out in terms of a production profile. I think people will be pleasantly surprised. Otherwise, we're proceeding really quite cautiously. The work we have to do from here to the finish line is not expensive, but it takes a little bit of time. And we're going to work very deliberately towards that, particularly once we get a price signal that tells us that it's really going to happen. And maybe that's going through $30. I'm not sure what the price signal will be exactly, but I think everybody's kind of waiting because we could have been in this. I could have given this talk 2 years ago with the way the uranium market's evolved. So that's been the challenge for us on the other side of the table. Again, I talked about LaSalle a little bit. It is actually production ready, but would require EFR to turn on their mill. Talked about Lahara Mesa. The big gorilla in Australia is called Westmoreland, ex-Rio Tinto project. We bought the land, then went to Rio, bought all the data. It's got 50 million plus pounds. It's capable of producing 4 million pounds a year or more for more than a decade. It's had 2 economic studies done on it. The most recent one in 2016. It's got a giant NPV, produces at about $23. It's basically a 2-to-1 strip open pit to a depth of 60 meters max. Right now, it's got exploration potential. It needs permitting and obviously a better price environment. This was a project that, thinking back when we had the project originally, we still think it will require some element of contracts realistically to get it off the ground because of the capital cost. Capital cost is probably on the order of the most recent capital cost was $300 million. So this will be a project that would ideally require your traditional contracting methodology where you get a suite of utilities and they buy maybe 40%, 50% contracted out for 10 years, and that underpins the whole financing of the project. But we have the luxury that we can bring Church Rock online first, and then this will be the secondary project. But for utility, it's very attractive to have a portfolio inside a single company because they obviously would prefer to deal with companies that can have delivery certainty over a period of time. There's the numbers on Westmoreland. The other project we have in Australia is basically all the extension of the land to the west of Westmoreland. We bought this from Rio Tinto as well. We were in a JV with Rio Tinto for a number of years. They finally gave up on it and basically allowed us to buy them out, and we're now going to get on with the exploration of the rest of the belt. This was all done post-Fukushima, so there hasn't been a lot of impetus to do a lot on this. We're excited about this, though, because it's probably one of the better greenfield things in the uranium business, certainly in Australia. And I think the Australians, unlike Canada, there's a lot of interest still in exploration, believe it or not. In Australia, there's a lot going on there. The ASX is pretty robust. So I think there'll be a lot of interest in Australia in this once we get going. So just summing it up, we're very well positioned for 232. We think we're very inexpensive. We've been around a long time. We think there's a lot of potential here for coming off the bottom. These are the stocks. These kind of stocks are going to go up 3, 4, 5 times. Frankly, before we probably ever get to maybe $40, when I think $40 is an absolute minimum to see any kind of revival of production by anybody on the development side. So I wouldn't wait. I guess the message is, I wouldn't wait for everything to come into place where they've got the economics in place that they can go and build a project. Because if history's any guide, a lot of the real money was made in the last cycle coming off the bottom with these companies well before they got into the part of the market where people are discerning about comparing the economics of this project versus that project. So that's our story in a nutshell. Happy to take any questions.
One quick question here, Terry.
Looking at Cody's bar chart about the values in this sector, is there an M&A possibility here to scale into the market so people that more attractive vehicles instead of one by one?
Well, there's that ETF obviously that's been developed. I mean, I think, are you talking about does it make sense to do an M&A roll up or something?
There's only 1/10 of the companies right now outstanding compared to what it was at the peak or something like that, and you got a lot of undervalued companies. Why don't you offer for the market one big company undervalued?
Well, I think all these M&A kind of discussions have been run to ground during the bear market, to be honest. I think most of us that made it to this point in the cycle are thinking if we've got a viable thing going forward, that I think these projects are going to get developed. There's also not a lot of synergy. Like, there isn't a lot of synergy that you would think from putting together two ISR projects, because they're basically separate well fields, other than head office overhead and things like that. EFR has basically done that to a degree, and I think that's part of the reason that EFR is the market cap leader in the United States. I think they've done enough different deals and put enough stuff together under one roof. You may see that happen, but I think it'll take the cycle to turn first.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. Appreciate it.